welcome to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink. This is the first in our new series, Cinema Slackers, where we take a psychedelic trip through some of cinema's greatest wanderers and drifters. Roll one up and listen in.
There you go. Appropriately enough, today we are going to be discussing 1978's Up in Smoke.
Hey, man. Am I driving okay?
I think we're parked, man.
Oh, shit. God damn, I was in that shit, man. I never had no dope like that before in my life, man. That's the heaviest shit I ever smoked, man. I mean, I smoked a lot of shit before, man. But god damn, man, that's heavy shit.
You okay?
I can't breathe.
What's the matter?
I can't breathe, man.
Well, here. Hey, man.
Oh,
Hey, I got something to mellow you out, man. You're just freaking out. Here.
I never smoked no shit like that before.
Take these,
What?
man. Take these. This'll
What is
mellow you
this?
out, man.
What is that, man?
Let's take them, man. Oh. Hey, don't take those, man.
What?
I almost gave you the wrong shit, man.
Hey, man, I already took them, man.
Oh.
Hey, what do you mean? Whoa.
Wow, man.
Hey, what was that shit, man?
You just ate the most acid I've ever seen anybody eat in my life.
Hey, man, I never had no acid before, man.
Geez, I hope you're not busy for about a month.
Shit, I'm gonna die, man. That stuff's gonna make me die,
Oh,
man.
No, that's good acid.
Hey, man, I never had it before, man. That's
Hey,
gonna
it
make me
won't
die.
hurt
Well,
you,
this is gonna
man.
make me freak out,
Nah,
man.
man.
I seen those guys that walk around my neighborhood had too many acid, man. Their head looked like a pumpkin like that, man.
Relax,
Like,
man.
what is it like?
Hey, mellow out, man.
So, Up in Smoke is a 1978 film written by Tommy Chong and Cheech Marin, directed by Tommy Chong and Lou Adler. And Up in Smoke follows the story of two young men who often refer to each other as man, pretty much at the end of every sentence. One man played by Tommy Chong, and the other played by Cheech. And basically they meet when Tommy Chong's character's car breaks down, a Volkswagen Beetle, which had a Rolls-Royce grill on the front for some strange reason. So Pedro, the character played by Cheech, picks him up, and the two of them go on a strange adventure where they end up transporting large volumes of marijuana and entering a battle of the bands. It's a pretty wild trip through Los Angeles and also through 1970s drug culture.
Yeah, I was trying to find a lighter to give some ambiance to this one, but I couldn't find one. This is their first film that they ever made together. They had been together for probably at least 10 years, making records, comedy albums, making music, songs that played on the radio, actually some pretty famous songs. One that's played actually in the film towards the end. And that one's called Earache My Eye, actually. I was looking into that earlier. This is their first film together, and they, here they play for the first time in a feature film the characters that they would go on to play in many other films and that they had played before, the perpetually stoned characters they kind of wander into different situations. They're very laid back, for obvious reasons. And their dynamic, the two of them together, it works really well. And it's hard to put your finger on exactly why, but something about it just works. And I guess when they met each other, they just felt that spark too, and that's why they were together for so long. I will be upfront that I don't have too much base knowledge of Cheech and Chong. This is actually the first time I've seen this movie. I have not seen any of their other films. I only have knowledge from things that you would see about them or references to them. So I know a decent amount of what the core of their comedy is, but I hadn't actually sat and watched one of their films before. So this was a very fun experience for me. It was interesting, and honestly, the movie was even funnier than I thought it would be, and even better than I thought it would be. So I really had a good time with it. But Jeremy, you had sort of grown up with it a bit. You said you had watched watch these films with your father a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, appropriately, it's a little, the films and the experience of them are a little hazy to me, because I'm
Appropriately
not
enough.
not because of my state of mind when I
Right.
watched them, but just because I was pretty young.
Yeah.
But this one I had actually seen rewatched a couple years ago, so in recent memory, and then of course rewatched it again for
Mhm.
this episode here. But this is definitely a favorite of mine. I have a special place in my heart for a couple things that are going on in this film. One is rock and roll music, which we already did our series on that, and this
Yeah.
one maybe could have fit into that.
Mhm.
Granted with a bit more of a comedic bent. It's not so much about the music
Well, there's that one
as it is.
line, the one line towards the end where they're going to play the concert where he's like, we play punk rock, man. We don't have to know how to play anything.
Yeah, which
Or something like that, which I thought was really funny.
brings back memories to rock and roll high school for those
Yeah.
who have
It's like, we don't
listened to all of our episodes.
we don't have to know what we're doing.
Yeah, it's punk music. We just have to be punks.
Right, exactly.
But yeah, this is definitely a favorite of mine. It's really, really pretty raunchy, which is fun. There's a lot of wild jokes in it. There's one.
Although I thought it was tamer than I had expected. I mean, but also that's coming, from 2019 where it's
Yeah,
like
I'm thinking in terms of 1978.
right. Yeah. No, there was
Knowing the other movies of the era, like there were some dangerous,
Mhm.
wild, but they were generally more serious movies that
Mhm.
would kind of push the limits like this. You
Yeah.
would see
Oh yeah.
a Martin Scorsese movie or
Mhm.
a Bertolucci movie push
Right.
the boundaries, but in terms
Certainly.
of comedy, it was still pretty
Yeah.
relatively tame at this point.
Certainly for the time. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think this did make a big splash when it debuted, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's pretty bad, but I also think it really kind of in the same way that a movie like Easy Rider tapped into the counterculture.
Mhm.
I think that this kind of hit a certain nerve with the young viewing public,
Mhm.
because they were talking about drug use in a really honest way
Yeah.
that wasn't. It didn't condemn it, but it also wasn't necessarily just like a cool thing.
Right.
It actually kind of accurately portrayed how, people who smoke a lot of weed, it's fun, it's wild, it's cool, but they also end up in kind of stupid, ridiculous situations
They
sometimes.
end up
and
in
that
court and
yeah, and
Yeah.
that the people who are spending their entire day smoking weed, aren't necessarily like sometimes their mind wanders.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily business people.
you can't always
They're-
trust them. Yeah. And-
Yeah.
Yeah, they were definitely very upfront with the drug use, which is
Mhm.
very refreshing to see, and I can see what you're saying is as far as just being in your face like that at that time, and also the time frame. When this film was made, I was thinking about that a lot as well, and it's kind of interesting because it is definitely counterculture, but it's almost at the end of all of that. It's kind of after.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of after a lot of the films that we've discussed already, where that was more prevalent. And
Mhm.
just in society, things, the way culture is going, these guys, they were doing it, to their credit, they were doing it at that time. They were making the albums and having the comedy shows and they were a team during that time. But this film in particular didn't really come about until towards the end of all that.
Mhm.
So that's interesting to think about. 1978, where
Yeah,
we
it's
were
late.
at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, we're definitely pushing closer to the 80s at this point,
Mhm.
which would obviously bring on a whole different kind of comedy movie.
Yeah.
These guys kind of launched the whole stoner comedy duo thing,
For sure.
which is what a lot of our series is going to revolve around
Yeah.
as we move forward. So it's interesting too because I saw a trailer for this movie and they mentioned that they were like the new Laurel and Hardy.
Yeah.
Which I could definitely see, but what's particularly interesting to me about Cheech and Chong paired together is that neither of them really plays the straight man.
Mhm.
Which traditionally a comedy duo, you'll have your one really wacky,
Yeah.
crazy guy, and then you'll have your one who
Mhm.
kind of plays as the foil to that to show how wacky and crazy the crazy guy is.
That is very true. Because like as I was watching the film, I was thinking of that, and I was like, oh, it's Cheech. Cheech is the straight man. But then something would happen. There'd be another scene. I'm like, oh, actually, Tommy, or well, he doesn't really have a name in the
Yeah.
the Chong
Man.
man. Yeah, Chong
Man.
is the straight man. But yeah, you're right. It's kind of there really isn't one, to be honest.
Yeah, it kind of goes in and out. I mean, I guess so. There's a police officer character
Mm-hmm.
who the whole time is trying to
Chasing them. Yeah.
is chasing them and trying to bust them for drugs they don't even know they have.
Stacy Keach, right, plays him, and he's actually very good in this movie.
Yeah, he's really good. Yeah, and I guess he's kind of the straight. So it's interesting because I think that this might have hit that nerve because the straight man kind of became, the old guard. It became the public.
Yeah.
the public who wasn't in on drug
Yeah.
culture.
It's like we don't need
That
that
kind of
man,
became
yeah.
that kind of became the straight man, and it made it seem like everyone who was smoking weed was wild and wacky and cool, which is kind of an innovative thing at the time because even if you look at other, like I mentioned Easy Rider before, but that Easy Rider kind of has the Captain America character who is still a man on a mission, and then you have the Dennis Hopper character who's kind of the more of the burnout. And it's interesting seeing these two guys and the shenanigans that they end up getting into, just because neither of them really has any kind of focus. I guess the Cheech character, Pedro, has a little bit more focus because he seems to want to start this band. So like we said, the big thing at the end is there's this big battle of the bands that they hear about, and neither of them really have any direction in their lives. Tommy Chong's character, Man, comes from an extremely wealthy family, but we kind of open the movie with his parents telling him that if he doesn't get a job and get his life together, they're going to send him to the military.
Which is, he's in his 40s at that time, right?
Yeah, he's definitely too old.
Yeah, in real life he was, so that's,
yeah.
I was like, trying to figure that out. I was like, okay, well, I guess that could work, yeah.
Well, and that's something that's kind of interesting to think about, is that the fact that across the board in most of these stoner slacker movies, the people, it doesn't focus on teenagers smoking weed, but it mostly focuses on people who are a little bit older.
Yeah, it's a lifestyle, yeah.
Yeah, it's a lifestyle. Like, they've made a conscious decision that as adults, their main focus is going to be chilling out. And kind of living off the grid a little bit. We'll see this especially in a few later episodes of this.
Oh yeah.
But this idea of these older people who actually their actions have real world ramifications, I think is another thing that made it funnier, because a lot of the like if we look at this is 1978, this is the counterculture growing up. So a lot of the people who were 15, 16, 17 years old in 1968, 1969 during the sexual revolution and the big hippie movement and everything, at this point are adults. They're 26, 27, 28 years old. So it is this weird moment where they probably were looking for someone who could represent where they are now. Because my guess would be that, and my knowledge of that time a little bit, is that the movies that were coming out that addressed drugs and sex and rock and roll music were targeted at a much younger audience, because that's how the counterculture was when it exploded. And this is kind of maybe one of the first movies that said, oh, we want to make a movie for the 27-year-olds who, when they get caught with weed, it isn't just a funny little thing because they're a teenager. It's a big problem. So it actually is enough that you can make a whole movie out of trying not to.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned Laurel and Hardy, because that's something I definitely thought about when I was watching this movie. I feel like for this generation, this was, I mean, to some degree, Cheech and Chong, they're in the spirit of the grand tradition of, the Three Stooges, the Marx Brothers, Laurel and Hardy. In some strange way, like, they are that same thing. So a completely different version of it, and an updated version. But yeah, there's besides there not really being a straight man, they are in that vein. So I kind of see that as well. It's almost like people were looking for some kind of something like that, and they came along and kind of fit that mold in their own way. So let's dive into the movie itself a little bit here. So this is their first film, as we said. So we do get introductions to each of the characters, which to me was very interesting. You only get very brief glimpses into each of their lives before they meet each other. And so we start with Cheech, or Pedro in the movie. And now, were those his kids, or is that when he wakes up, there's two kids there, and he wakes up on a couch, and I didn't know if that was meant to just be like a random place that he woke up, or if those are meant to be his. I'm assuming that was just a random place, right?
Yeah, I mean, okay. I think that that's kind of the beauty of it, is that you have this movie that kind of launches the whole stoner movie movement, and it just opens with a guy on a couch with no explanation.
Yeah.
Like, where it never seems to reference it again.
Never.
So it's possible that my thought was maybe like younger siblings.
Okay.
But who knows? I mean, maybe they're his kids.
My first thought was like, oh, okay, I didn't know Cheech was gonna have kids in this movie. That's an interesting choice. But they never go into it or mention it ever again. So it could be anyone, which is hilarious also. And then we go to Man. Who I believe they actually refer to him as Anthony, but I think he's only credited as
he's just Man.
Yeah. So then you have the rich parents giving Man a hard time. telling him to get his life together, get a job. Which, if he is in his 40s, I mean, granted, they're
Reasonable.
probably right on that one, if he's still living at home. So, but anyway, so I thought that was a great way to start the movie off. And honestly, the first 25 minutes of this movie, very engaging and very funny, and I was like really with it. I do think as the movie progresses, if you're not totally on board, I feel like it does kind of. I would say the pace kind of gets a little bit slower, and the jokes are a little bit further apart and stuff like that. So, but those first 20 minutes I would say are very strong.
Yeah.
And I did enjoy the movie as a whole. I'm just saying, like, as a kind of objective, if you're looking at it from just like a film watching standpoint, it does probably get a little slower as it goes. But
Yeah, it does meander a bit, which once
yeah,
again,
which makes
it
sense.
makes sense.
Yeah.
It makes sense that it meanders because,
Yeah.
and I think that is part of the charm.
Mhm.
And I think that once again, if we think about audience, it might not have mattered as much
Yeah.
when it came out because we hadn't seen this kind of absurdist adventure story,
Right.
which is kind of what it is ultimately. Is really it's an adventure story. It's about two guys
Yeah.
getting into all kinds of trouble with no real knowledge that they're even in the trouble.
Yeah.
And so I think that upon its release, that might have felt a lot more innovative. And now we've seen so many movies.
Yeah.
It's like The Hangover.
Mhm.
So there's just so many movies about kind of stupid or off the
Stoners
beat
and-
stoner guys who get into a trouble that's over the Pineapple Express. That now we're
Pineapple
used to
Express
it.
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, we're used to a tighter kind of more jokey format, but at the time, just the idea alone was probably enough that it was really engaging and really wild. Even when the plot kind of went in a weird direction and meandered a little bit, the jokes were a little sparse at times. But I do think there were some great, in terms of jokes, I do think there were some great set pieces where they were able to
for sure.
get the joke going and just keep it going. Like there's this one point late in the movie where Tommy Chong's character is sitting in a van, and he's fallen asleep, and everyone else is outside the van. It's just him and this young woman in a van, and she's going on talking to him
Oh, right.
about the orgasm sounds of some other woman she knows, and he's asleep, and he wakes up and his leg is fallen asleep, so he's trying to shake the leg out, and the van starts shaking, and she's screaming, mimicking these orgasm sounds, and there's like 50 people outside of the van thinking that something else is going on.
Right.
And it's good visual humor.
It is.
It uses the form of movies really in an interesting way. Or another example is sometimes they're driving around and they're smoking, and the car literally looks like it's on fire because of how much smoke is in the car, and they use these really beautiful images to tell a joke rather than just having them say the jokes the whole time, which is something I'm really fond of.
Yeah, and something else I noticed when I was watching is that the comedy itself is a lot smarter than either of the characters, I would say, which is why it kind of works, in my opinion. The fact that they knew what they were doing and clearly took the time to make some well-crafted jokes and there's some clever wordplay in there. Got like kind of back and forth that reminded me of some of the older comedy style. But there was a lot of that going on in the scenes, and a lot of like I said, like well-crafted humor that you wouldn't necessarily think going into it. But I think that's why it does work. Because I'm sure, like many comedians, they were serious about their comedy. They wanted to. They set out to make comedy. They set out to make a funny movie. So, and also, for as silly as the characters are, I would say there's a kind of longing and desperation in them that makes them relatable. Even if you're not, smoking 24/7, you're not a stoner, you can still relate to these characters for sure in many different ways. They're always left out. They're left behind of whatever's going on in society. And they're just doing their own thing, and this movie, there is a nice leisurely pace to the movie, which we did talk about, which I do think works in its favor for the most part. So the plot doesn't actually kick in till at least probably a good half hour in.
Yeah, so basically, and once again, we're hoping that you've watched the movie and you'll understand, but just in case.
Well, okay, so the two characters, they meet. Let's get that. Yeah, so the two characters end up meeting, and it's kind of a chance meeting, right? I think he just Pedro just picks up man on the side of the road like a hitchhiker.
Yeah, he's just hitchhiking. Yeah.
And that's actually, I think, the funniest scene when it's just the two of them in the car together. And that's really that just shows you like the leisurely pace. They're just sitting in that car, and that was the one scene I had known before I saw the movie where they are essentially smoking dog shit. and I knew that was coming. But when it happens, it was even funnier than I expected it to be.
Yeah. They're not actually driving. They're just sitting in a parked
yeah,
car.
they're just sitting in a parked car, and he's like, "Oh, I don't think
on
we're
the side of
moving,
the
man."
road.
Yeah, and they're just sitting on the side of the road. The cop comes up to them, So that scene's great. The whole meeting between them is great.
Yeah, so they end up they go down to Mexico, which was another really, really, in my opinion, funny thing is that these immigration officers show up, and you find out that Cheech and all of his family members have called the immigration officers on themselves because there's a wedding in Mexico,
Yeah.
and that it's a free ride and a free meal, and that they're just planning on coming back anyways.
Yeah, that's great.
Which, in my opinion, actually it was a kind of really subtle, interesting political statement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a little bit of that in there.
And there was definitely a little bit of politics snuck into this movie in weird places. Yeah. And nothing particularly overt or groundbreaking, but in really small ways it kind of poked at how people could get left behind or not be considered as part of society just because of their background or their lifestyle choices and really looked down upon for no good reason. Mm-hmm. But basically, they go to Mexico and they're supposed to grab this van and drive it back to the United States, not realizing that the van is made out of marijuana that has somehow, they don't really explain the science, they kind of do, been turned into a plastic that it can be molded into television sets and apparently automobiles. So they're driving this van around. Basically, I mean, their real challenge through the movie is that they're looking for weed.
Yeah.
They're
that's
really
like the big joke through the entire movie is that they're literally driving, a car made of weed, and they're looking for.
They can't find it.
They can't find it anywhere. Yeah, no one knows. No one realizes it, and that's like the big joke of the whole thing. Yeah.
And the great thing is too is that this is almost calls back to like Looney Tunes or early cartoons and stuff, is the fact that they don't realize why they're even being chased.
Yeah.
The police start chasing them, but they don't even totally realize they're being chased, and they don't know why. But because they're so oblivious to it, they're making the perfect decisions to get away from the cops. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Whereas if they knew, if they were trying to run away, that these two people would not be able to successfully run away because they're so goofy and so incompetent. But because all they're trying to do is get to a battle of the bands and score some weed, they're able to totally evade the police officers and make the police officers' lives miserable.
The one scene, I mean, like a lot of what they do is totally out of their, or a lot of what happens to them is totally out of their hands. But like you said, they somehow manage by the skin of their teeth to get out of things without even realizing it. Like in particular, the scene I think of is when the cop pulls them over when they're in the weed van or whatever it was, and he pulls them over, and for some reason the smoke, part of the vehicle is like smoking and so the smoke comes out, and one thing leads to another, and the cop gets high, standing there trying to pull them over, and he doesn't even know where he is. He asks him for a hot dog that he's eating. I thought that was a really funny scene. That's just a good use of that, that ongoing joke they had there.
Oh, there's the other one with the nuns. There's one point when they're at a border checkpoint, and Man is smoking this gigantic joint, which he seems to do throughout this movie.
All the joints are huge in this
They're
movie.
humongous. They're unrealistically giant, which I think also might be a kind of funny statement on the fact that he's like just this really rich kid / man, and he's able to, without working, just afford copious amounts of pot. But he just tosses the joint out the window as they get to this border checkpoint, and there's a car full of nuns next to them, and the joint lands in the nuns' car, and the nuns all end up getting frisked and arrested,
right?
And they just keep driving, So it's like all these things that by no agency of their own, they're able to evade some of the most intense security and police in the country. And, just keep getting away and keep driving around. And I think that also is kind of the spirit of, like drug culture, particularly at that time, is like, you're kind of against the man, but at the same time, you're just trying to have a good time. So I think a movie that allowed these two people to be against the man while only trying to enjoy themselves and not having to protest, not having to do anything serious.
They weren't consciously trying to be against the man. Yeah, they just were,
Yeah, they're just trying to chill, and by doing that, they've somehow managed to upend the very fibers of society. And I think that has had a real appeal then, and I think that it has a real appeal now. We still see plenty of movies and television shows that use kind of the same formula of the the unwitting. I mean, I was just listening to an interview with Jeff Daniels yesterday, and he was talking about Dumb and Dumber, which this is pretty much a blueprint for Dumb and Dumber.
Yep.
In a weird way, it's one of those things where, and obviously Cheech and Chong weren't the first big comedy duo. There were hundreds and hundreds before them, but I think they were maybe the first comedy duo
to do this kind of thing.
Yeah, that really hit on like the youth. It wasn't your parents' comedy duo who you could go watch. Like if you're a 17, 18-year-old kid in 1978, you're not going to go want to see this movie with your parents. You're going to want to see this with your friends.
Right.
And I think that made it a certain talking point.
It was like dangerous
and
a little bit.
Cultural thing. Yeah, you hang up the poster. Like it was something that a young person could really have a sense of ownership over, because it kind of felt like them and their friends, but a much dumber version of them and their friends, which made it fun.
It's like they could laugh at themselves while also just enjoying, what they like to do and what they're kind of, not necessarily that everyone that listens to them smokes weed, but it's just the spirit of it, more than anything.
And it didn't talk down to that audience either.
No,
which I think was important.
Yeah, definitely.
Because there were probably, and I've definitely seen movies at the time that would represent the pot smoking hippie as kind of this total burnout character without ever actually exploring who that human being is. And I think that's something that's important. I heard another interview last week with this guy named Jeff Baena, who he directed the movie The Little Hours, and he also did Life After Beth, which, side note, are just two amazing movies if anyone's looking for recommendations. But he was talking about how he was watching, I think it was like Avatar or something, and there were just hundreds and hundreds of those blue Avatar creatures just dying at one point, and it never really hit on it because it was just this big battle that was raging on, and it never got inside who are those people. And he was like, I had this panic attack because I wanted to know the lives of all these people. And I think that probably at the time there was this real stereotype of like the pothead that was probably kind of patronizing and would kind of trivialize that person. But meanwhile, it made up a pretty large portion of the young population. So this movie really said, hey, there is this stupid, goofy stuff that goes on, but they're actually human beings with lives dealing with problems like their parents breathing down their neck, not having enough money, not being sure what they want to do with themselves. And by taking on maybe some of those more serious themes, they were allowed to be funnier and less serious.
Yeah, and the authority figures, the police in this movie, are not exactly the best cops around. So I think that was also like a little bit of a commentary there. We talked about how we think there's some social commentary going on here, obviously. But that's also just like, whatever, damn the man. But also, it's funny because as much as this movie and this duo went on to inspire, and create all these movies in the same vein and movies that were trying to do similar team up stoner type ideas, this movie reminded me a lot of the Blues Brothers, another cult,
I was thinking that too.
Another big cult movie which didn't come out until very soon after, but
that was 1980, right?
Yeah,
1981.
80, yeah. And the fact that they're these two guys being chased by police constantly, it even ends at a concert, which both movies do, and obviously very different characters, but and very different movies, but they both have that kind of crazy anarchic kind of.
That's very interesting, actually. That's a good point. They do have a lot in common. It's just that the Blues Brothers seem to be really serious about the music.
Yeah.
And Cheech and Chong seem to be serious about trying to get themselves to the place where the music is happening. Competently.
They still have dreams, but they're just not.
It's more. They're very small dreams.
Maybe more to get chicks and score some weed than anything else. But yeah, I mean, they like to have a good time, and they do like to play music. So there's a lot of parallels there, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think it's funny too, because with these guys, when they get to the Battle of Bands, like they write the song in 5 minutes before they go on. Like true. There's no band practice. There's no we need to find the best musicians. It's like, oh, hey man, you have a drum? You have a drum kit? You're in the band, you know? Oh, it's like, oh, hey, you sing? Yeah, all right. You're in the band. Whereas
the Blues Brothers, they knew Cab Calloway and they could call in their friends to come, these really like big music celebrities and everything, which is it's funny, like the attitudes are kind of the same but also completely different.
Which I'm realizing now, the Blues Brothers in a way is kind of just like the Seven Samurai. Or like,
That's
you know what I mean? Or like
interesting.
the
Yeah,
Magnificent Seven, like the
Yeah.
whole movie is like they go around, gather up a team, and
Yeah,
then
they do
have this
kind of
big
do that.
event.
Yeah,
It's kind of the same,
it is kind of the same.
which is I mean, you know,
That's
hey,
a whole
you
nother
borrow
episode
from
right there.
that's a whole other episode, but it's kind of dawned on me.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, so I don't know. I think this movie, you know, if you're into stoner comedies, which I certainly am, you know, especially back in like high school and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
this kind of thing was the funniest thing on the planet. Um, yeah, this for me is definitely like a must see. Just even if you just want to understand the genre,
Mm-hmm.
or if you know
This is
you're
where it all
just
began, almost.
this is
Yeah.
where it all began,
Yeah.
and it's also you know it's also just nice because it's just fun to watch.
Yeah.
You know, it's
That's
not
what
heavy.
when I was watching, I was like, it's just a fun movie. Like,
It's just yeah, it's just enjoyable.
yeah, it's very enjoyable, for sure.
It's short. It's only like an 85, 86
Yeah,
minute movie.
which is a
Like
great
like
length.
it's a
Yeah.
yeah, it's a good way to just spend you know a half a night
Yeah.
or an afternoon. You just call up a couple friends
Mm-hmm.
and say, hey, you know, let's just watch this movie, and
Uh-huh.
you know everyone will leave with a smile on their face. And
Maybe because of other things, but I mean,
yeah,
you definitely. That's the other thing. I mean, I was not intoxicated when I watched it, and I had a great, I had a great time.
yeah.
You don't have to do that, but I'm sure, like any other thing, it could enhance it if you're
Mhm.
into it. But yeah, by itself, just as a comedy film, I think it really holds up even to this day.
Yeah, totally. And I think that, and a big reason for that is like what you mentioned before, is that the humor is smart.
Yeah,
You know, the humor in this movie is intelligent.
that's what it comes down to.
It doesn't feel like this is a movie that said, we're going to make jokes for people who are high.
Yeah.
It's, we're going to make jokes for people who
Because
like jokes, whether they're high or not.
But some of these types of movies that came after this certainly
Yeah.
played to that kind of, all right, we're gonna make this really trippy and like all that kind of stuff, which this movie does not at all. So
No.
I find that very interesting as well, because this is the one that started it all. So
Yeah. The trippiest, I mean, there is really no like first person
No.
drug experience. The most they get, you know, there's no like psychedelic, you
No.
know, change in color. The most they get to is they're in a courtroom at one point and the man character has just taken a lot of drugs, and he takes enough drugs in this movie to have died like 5
yeah,
times.
definitely.
Like he just and also I like that at one point the Cheech character just eats a lot of acid, and it's never referenced again that he's stripping.
Yeah.
But like if you think about it, this entire movie he's probably like
Yeah. With
somewhere else entirely.
with these characters, you just assume they're always tripping or
You just
always
assume-
high, or But that's kind of the fun thing about it, It's
Yeah, like there's one but there's one really cool shot. They're in like a courtroom, and all of a sudden, you know, the Tommy Chong character is kind of passing out because he's taken too many drugs. And for a moment, we go to his first person point of view as he's like falling over, and the camera kind of does this weird like swing that, and like that for me, like that was all I kind of needed to understand, because it's like, oh, you know, he's not seeing things, he's just tired. Like he just cannot even keep himself together enough to sit up straight.
Well, speaking of the camera, I do want to go into just a little bit behind the the crew that put this together, because there is a credited director. It's Lou Adler, who has a cult connection because he was a producer on Rocky Horror Picture Show, the movie, Shock Treatment. It's sort of semi-sequel. And he directed only 2 films. One of them was this, Up in Smoke, his first one. And then after that, Ladies and Gentlemen, The Fabulous Stains, which I have not seen, but is a huge cult movie as well. And then he was mostly a producer and things like that. But so I also noticed that Tommy Chong is the uncredited director. I think he actually was behind the camera on a couple of the scenes of this movie, and he would go on to direct almost all of their subsequent films for Cheech and Chong. So I found that interesting as well, because a little bit of what me and Jeremy talked about before the episode was like, who was running things behind the scenes. There's always one person when there's a comedy duo or team. There's always someone who likes to take charge, and someone who's the director or the writer or whatever. And so we were saying maybe it was Tommy Chong, maybe it was Cheech, because he eventually left the duo, went off on his own to do his own thing. So I mean, that's something to look into more if you're interested. I'm sure there's lots of articles and history on Cheech and Chong to look into, where their career eventually went, their subsequent breakup, and then they got back together sort of later on. It's actually more dramatic than you would think. But and then another quick connection there, I have to give a shout out to Jack Nicholson. We have many references to Jack Nicholson in many of the films we talk about. So our Jack Nicholson connection for this one is the car that Tommy Chong drives at the beginning of the movie is actually owned by Jack Nicholson.
Really, I didn't even know that.
Yeah, that was
I'm telling you, Jack Nicholson.
that was one of the trivia things I saw, and I was like, that's perfect.
Jack
Because,
Nicholson. Every movie made between 1965 and forever, Jack Nicholson
yeah,
maybe has something to do with it.
something he has his hand in it somehow.
He has his hand in, yeah.
Even spiritually, he's just there. Because I
He's
think
just there.
he was shown a screening of this film. I think right after it was done, and I think he had just been in a car crash and he was not feeling good, but. He was just laughing through the entire movie, and it hurt every time he laughed. But so I like that image as well. So
Yeah.
Jack Nicholson's always, he's always there.
Always.
Yeah.
And this movie did really well when it came
Yeah,
out.
it
Was made for not a lot of money, and it made a lot of money.
It came out a little bit smaller scale, and then it kind of took off. When more and more people started seeing it.
And and now you can probably find a poster in every
Yeah.
somewhere in every dorm building, and
Mm-hmm. And obviously they went on to do many more films together, Cheech and Chong, after this, including Cheech and Chong's next movie, which was the next one after this. And to kind of wrap things up, I just wanted to ask you a question, because we touched on this a little bit, and we talked about how this film, there's some critiques going on of culture and of authority figures and things like that. Do you think this movie, at the end of the day, would you call it mostly surface comedy, or do you think there is also a commentary on weed culture mixed in, on drug culture, I would say, in particular?
I think that at the time, it was probably more just let's be as funny as we possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
I think that
they weren't really conscious of it, you think?
Yeah, I think that certain things that were probably on their minds got worked in, but I'm not sure that the goal was, let's make a statement. I think all these years later now, this movie came out 41 years ago. All these years later, it maybe makes a little bit more of a commentary, because we have the perspective to see how the culture has evolved.
Mm-hmm.
So I think kind of both.
Mm-hmm.
I think at the time, maybe not so much. Now, all these years later, I think it kind of set up the prototype of what that kind of individual looks like, but it also kind of dove into what it kind of means to be lost and not sure what your ambitions are in your 20s or 30s, and just kind of drifting along, which is a very real thing to deal with. But the way it dealt with it, I think ultimately just kind of was on the surface.
Yeah, and I think in the end, Cheech and Chong come from a grand tradition, like we talked about with comedy duos and comedy teams of the past, but they did it while doing their own thing. And I think you can see, obviously, it was very influential. You can see echoes of what they did in many comedy movies to come, including at least one that we're going to be discussing in this series. One that comes to mind, which I want to make that a surprise, because I don't think people would expect us to talk about a certain movie we're going to be talking about eventually. Yeah. So, but yeah, you can see echoes of this film and this comedy duo, all in tons and tons of movies, many of which I'm sure we'll be discussing on this show. So, anything you wanted to add to wrap it up today, Jeremy?
No, just great, really fun film. If you're having a bad day, watch it because it'll cheer you up. If you're having a good day, watch it because it'll be funny and it'll keep you in your good mood.
Either way.
Just a fun movie to watch. Definitely worth checking it out if you haven't seen it.
Great. Yeah, it's a fun one for sure.
In the next episode of our series Cinema Slackers, we'll be diving into the Sundance generation with Richard Linklater's seminal 1991 film Slacker.
All right, well, thanks for listening to Cult Movie Cult. You can find us on iTunes, Podbean, and Spotify. We are now on Spotify, as well as on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.